out of Alberta. A short time ago, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith outlined her province's path forward with Mark Carney's government. CBC's Julia Wong was watching that. She joins us now. Julia, there were a lot of takeaways. What were the main points that stick with you?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of her address, Danielle Smith, was essentially re-airing a list of grievances that she's had with Ottawa and that she's had with the federal Liberal government. You know, she talked about how Liberal policies have stifled Alberta's free economy, how it's affected people's livelihoods. And she also says that Canada, in her opinion, is not being viewed as an attractive place to invest. She said that the rest of the world is looking at this country's anti-energy policies and thinking that Canada has essentially lost its mind. So she wants to move forward with a few different things. One of them being appointing a special negotiating team that will negotiate with Ottawa on some specific reforms. And she also will be appointing an Alberta Next panel to discuss Alberta's future within the country. Now, she says it's likely that some of those ideas that are discussed with this panel will then be put to a provincial referendum. And then she says that Albertans will be able to vote on them sometime next year. Now, it's really important to note, though, that this address, all of what she's saying, is happening within a very special context, as there are more conversations happening in this province about Alberta separating from the rest of Canada.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, that being separation. We are well aware that there is a large and growing number of Albertans that have lost hope in Alberta having a free and prosperous future as a part of Canada. Many of these Albertans are organizing petitions to trigger a citizen-initiated referendum, as I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of these individuals are not fringe voices to be marginalized or vilified. They are loyal Albertans.
Now, it's important to note that the day after the federal election, Smith's United Conservative government did table legislation that would lower the threshold for a referendum to take place, essentially making it easier for there to be a referendum on Alberta separatism.
She made some specific demands of Mark Carney's government. What were they?
Yeah, so she's calling for guaranteed access to tidewater for Alberta's oil, gas, and critical minerals. She also wants Ottawa to end what she calls federal interference in the development of provincial resources. So repealing things like Bill C-69, which is the Federal Impact Assessment Act, and removing the proposed oil and gas emissions cap. She's also insisting that Ottawa refrain from slapping an export tax on Alberta resources. We know that that is something that has been discussed, though not enacted, as a result of this trade war with the United States. And she's calling for the same per capita federal transfers and equalization as British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. Now, we did speak with one political science professor who says at this point in time, with everything happening in this province, he believes that Smith may actually have the upper hand in these negotiations.
I think the Premier is probably very happy that there is significant separatist discontent or separatist aspiration in Alberta. I do take her at her word that she wouldn't like to see it come to fruition, but I think it's perceived as advantageous to the strategy of the provincial government to promote or to not put down those kinds of feelings.
So to be clear, this was an address that Smith was making to the province, and there were no media present at that particular address. But tomorrow, Smith will be holding a press conference where media will actually be able to get the chance to ask her some pointed questions about some of those reforms and some of the things that she's calling for specifically from Ottawa.
CBC's Julia Wong in Edmonton. Thank you, Julia. My next guest says it's now up to Prime Minister Mark Carney to negotiate. Erika Barootes is the former Principal Secretary to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, founding president of the United Conservative Party, and a co-host of the Alberta Politics podcast, The Discourse. Erika, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I think what we heard from Danielle Smith today was as clear a path to a vote on possible separation as we've heard yet. She's not saying that she supports it, but what did you make of the very, she very specifically outlined what needs to happen for that vote to take place?
Yeah, she also very specifically outlined that she is not in support of separating from the country. And you know what, this has been very clearly outset. There was nothing really new about today. And so, in Ottawa, you might be sitting there and be like, well, what is she coming to the table with that's new? This address, as your reporter was just covering, this was to Albertans. You would be surprised at how much conversation and individuals talking about being discontent with Ottawa, that we voted for change and that's not the outcome of the election, and we get that. However, that's how democracy works. But that there is an ongoing and growing frustration that we aren't being treated equally. And therefore, I think the Premier was right to come out today to get ahead of all of this and talk to Albertans directly through the medium of X and Facebook, as she did today.
I think that Danielle Smith is and has said before that stability and certainty is so important in uncertain economic times. And I have lived in Alberta. I am familiar with the kind of sentiment that you're talking about here in terms of being, upset with Ottawa in Alberta. But is talk of separation, and I grant you that there are those in the province who are speaking that way, but is it coming from the Premier's office necessarily a good idea if what you're trying to do is promote that stability and certainty?
Well, she came out today to basically say, and she said she had a productive first meeting with Prime Minister Carney, that Alberta's position has been clear and continues to be quite clear of what the expectations are to repair this, relatively toxic relationship that we have with Ottawa. And so I don't think the Premier is preemptively saying anything besides, I love this country, I want to stay in this country, but, I've got a big population and a growing population that's frustrated. So, Mark Carney, if you're listening, let's talk logistics, because he has said a lot of great things. Premier Scott Moe has also highlighted during his election run, he did say some very appetizing things to the West and to address Western alienation. Now it's about the action. And she said that specifically in her speech, that actions speak louder than words, and that's what Alberta is expecting. She was talking to all Albertans, and actually I think giving the certainty that we're not jumping ship, but we're here to look at how we make this possible and fix and repair the relationship that Alberta has had with Ottawa for at least the last decade.
She made some pretty specific demands in terms of what needs to happen, what Ottawa needs to do. Among them, repealing the No New Pipelines, which is Bill C-69, and then C-48, which is the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. But she and others do call it the tanker ban, specifically looking to keep tankers of a certain size off a specific part of the west coast of British Columbia. And she also wants access to all coasts, Arctic, West, and East. When you hear that, I can appreciate that is what Alberta wants. What do you imagine those negotiations are like, and do you think that Ottawa can actually meet them in in a time frame that is suitable to Danielle Smith?
Well, that's exactly what they are. They're negotiations. These are what Alberta wants to see and what they deem fair in any negotiation. I think that they've probably picked a few on that list that are able to be compromised or discussed. Now, I do not ideologically agree with the Prime Minister, obviously, but I do not envy his position, because he is in a tough situation with having a minority government, having to work with very anti-pipeline individuals and elected officials to be able to move an agenda. But he's going to have to act quick. He's going to have to, and he has recognized that the West has certain sentiments towards Ottawa. And so I hope that in the best interest of Alberta and the best interest of Canada, that the Prime Minister does come to the table and has an actual conversation with the Alberta Premier. And I'll go as far as to say with a lot of the Western Canadian premiers of how do we collectively work together to move forward.
So 2026 comes. She's already said that there will be a question put to citizens, voters in Alberta. That will be based on the Alberta panel, I think that's what she's calling it, and they're going to do some consultations, decide what needs to be put to voters in terms of a referendum question. And then there's also the possibility of this citizen-led question on separation. You're in Alberta. Yes, you have the pulse of the province. What are your thoughts? Do you think we're going to see that question on the ballot? On separation?
Yeah, I think the earliest that we could see it and where we would see it for those that don't live here is the citizen-led initiative, as you were talking about Bill 54 that was introduced. The earliest we'd see is municipal election, which we have here in October. So if individuals, are organized and there is a will, I do not think that the Premier would get in the way of that democratic right that there's a policy in place for that fulsome discussion to occur. So we might see that. And you know what? I open and welcome that conversation because I would really love to know where Albertans sit on all of this. I've never had more conversations about what does this look like for us. I'm from Saskatchewan. People being like, do I need to move to Alberta? Conversations like that I never thought would be real. And they really started after last Monday's results. So I think that we might see it. I wouldn't be shocked if we didn't see a citizen-led referendum come forward in the fall. And I think for 2026, I was the president of the United Conservative Party when the first Fair Deal panel went through. I wouldn't be surprised. They highlighted a lot of the demands in which Premier Smith is still asking for. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe one or two of those were coming forward in the next year. But I just hope we can find a path forward. And I think right now it's in the court of Prime Minister Carney.
Erika Barootes is the former Principal Secretary to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, founding president of the United Conservative Party, co-host of the Alberta Politics podcast, The Discourse. Good conversation. Thank you, Erika.
Thank you.